Have you ever noticed something strange? The people who called you too emotional were often the same people who never knew how to talk about their own feelings. The people who said you cared too much usually cared too little. The people who told you to lower your expectations had already settled for less themselves. So here's a question that might change the way you see your entire life. What if you were never too much? What if you've simply spent years trying to fit inside rooms that were always too small for the person you were becoming? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the deepest, kindest, and most emotionally intelligent people spend years believing they're too much, when in reality, they've simply never met someone capable of meeting them at their own depth. And one realization near the end may completely change the way you choose your relationships from this day forward. There is a certain kind of person psychology doesn't talk about enough. They don't ask for perfection. They don't expect people to read their minds. They don't want constant attention. What they want is something much rarer: honesty, consistencies, presence. But somehow, those simple desires become labels. You're too intense. You think too much. You care too much. You expect too much. After hearing these words enough times, something dangerous begins to happen. Instead of questioning whether the relationship was wrong, they begin questioning themselves. Maybe I really am difficult. Maybe I should stop caring. Maybe I should become easier to love. And little by little, they start shrinking. They laugh a little quieter. They stop asking the deeper questions. They pretend they're okay when they aren't. They lower their standards until they barely recognize themselves. Not because they've changed, but because they believe becoming smaller is the price of being accepted. Psychology has a name for this. It's called self-silencing, the gradual habit of suppressing your real thoughts, emotions, and needs in order to preserve connection. At first, it feels harmless. Eventually, it feels like living someone else's life. But here's what almost nobody tells you. The problem was never your depth. The problem was trying to receive deep understanding from people who only knew surface-level connection. And that brings us to the first truth. The first sign. You keep mistaking emotional mismatch for personal failure. This is where almost everyone gets it wrong. Imagine two people trying to have a conversation. One speaks an entire language. The other only knows a few words. When they fail to understand each other, whose fault is it? Neither. They're simply speaking from different capacities. Relationships work the same way. One person communicates with vulnerability. The other communicates with avoidance. One wants difficult conversations. The other changes the subject. One believes conflict creates closeness. The other believes conflict means the relationship is ending. Neither person necessarily has bad intentions, but they're living in completely different emotional worlds. Yet the person who feels more deeply usually blames themselves. I should stop asking. I should stop needing reassurance. I should stop expecting so much. Notice what happened. Instead of questioning compatibility, they question their worth. This is one of the most common psychological traps in emotionally aware people. They assume every unmet need is evidence that they're asking for too much. But asking the wrong person for understanding doesn't make understanding an unreasonable need. It simply means you've been requesting something from someone who doesn't yet know how to give it. There's an important difference. And once you see it, you'll never interpret rejection the same way again. Because sometimes rejection isn't saying, you're too much. Sometimes it's quietly saying, I'm not capable of loving someone at your depth. Those are two completely different sentences. Most people never learn the difference, which leads to something even more painful. And this next pattern is where countless people slowly abandon themselves without even realizing they're doing it. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens one compromise at a time. Let's talk about that. The second sign. You started editing yourself before anyone else could reject. You think about the last time you wanted to say how you really felt. Maybe someone disappointed you. Maybe they kept disappearing and coming back whenever it suited them. Maybe you needed reassurance. Maybe you simply wanted to feel chosen. But instead of saying what was in your heart, you paused. You rewrote the text message 3 times, deleted a sentence, softened your words, added a laughing emoji, told yourself, it's not a big deal. I'm probably overreacting. I don't want to seem needy. That moment is far more important than it looks. Because psychology tells us that people who repeatedly feel misunderstood often begin practicing something called anticipatory rejection. They reject themselves before anyone else has the chance to. It feels safer if I ask for less. I can't be disappointed if I care less. I can't be hurt if I become easier. People won't leave. But here's the tragedy. The version of you that finally gets accepted is no longer the real you. People aren't loving your authenticity. They're loving your performance. And deep down, you know it. That's why so many people feel lonely inside relationships. Not because they're alone, but because nobody is actually meeting the person hidden underneath the mask. The hardest loneliness isn't being by yourself. It's pretending to be someone else just to keep someone beside you. And every time you abandon your own needs to protect the relationship survives, while your sense of self slowly disappears. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. Are you afraid of losing people, or are you afraid they'll discover the real version of you and decide you're still not enough? Because those are completely different fears. One comes from loss, the other comes from shame. And shame has convinced millions of beautiful people that their biggest strength, their capacity to love deeply, is actually a flaw. But what if that very depth is the thing someone else has been searching for all along? Let's go deeper. Because the next realization explains why the wrong people always seem overwhelmed by you, while the right people feel relieved they've finally found you. The third sign. Emotionally unavailable people will always make healthy love feel impossible. Imagine trying to fill a tiny glass with water from a river. The river isn't too much. The glass is simply too small. This is exactly what happens in emotionally mismatched relationships. A person who struggles with vulnerability often experiences genuine intimacy as pressure. Simple honesty feels overwhelming. Consistency feels demanding. Healthy communication feels like criticism. And emotional closeness feels like losing control. So when you ask perfectly reasonable questions, they don't hear curiosity, they hear pressure. When you express your feelings, they don't hear honesty, they hear conflict. When you ask where the relationship is going, they don't hear commitment, they hear obligation. Eventually, they respond with familiar phrases. You're asking for too much. Why can't you just relax? You're making everything so complicated. But notice something. They never actually explain why your needs are unreasonable. They simply explain why meeting them feels uncomfortable. That's an enormous psychological difference. Because discomfort is not evidence that your expectations are excessive. Sometimes, it's evidence that another person's emotional capacity has reached its limit. And that's okay. Not everyone has the same capacity. Not everyone has done the same healing. Not everyone knows how to stay present when conversations become emotionally honest. But their limitation doesn't define your value. Read that again. Someone else's emotional ceiling is not proof that your emotional depth is a problem. In fact, the healthiest relationships often feel surprisingly ordinary. You don't have to convince someone to communicate. You don't have to beg for consistencies. You don't have to earn basic respect. You don't have to constantly wonder where you stand. Because emotionally mature people don't make love feel like a puzzle. They make it feel like peace. And if you've spent years chasing emotionally unavailable people, that kind of peace might actually feel unfamiliar. Which brings us to one of the biggest misunderstandings about love. Most people think chemistry is the strongest sign of compatibility. Psychology suggests something very different. And understanding this may save you years of unnecessary heartbreak. The fourth sign. You've been chasing chemistry when what you really needed was compatibility. This is where countless people confuse intensity with connection. Think about the relationships that consumed your mind. The ones where every text message felt like a victory, every reply felt like relief, every moment of affection felt like proof that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. It felt exciting, powerful, almost addictive. But psychology has a fascinating explanation for this. Our nervous system doesn't always chase what's healthy. It often chases what's familiar. If love once felt unpredictable, then predictability can actually feel boring. If affection had to be earned, then effortless love may feel suspicious. If your emotional needs were ignored growing up, someone emotionally unavailable can feel strangely familiar. Not because they're your soulmate, because they're activating an old emotional blueprint. Psychologists sometimes describe this as repetition, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar emotional dynamics in hopes of finally changing the ending. Your mind believes, if I can make this person choose me, maybe I'll finally heal the wound that started years ago. But healing doesn't happen by finding someone who repeats the wound. Healing begins when someone no longer requires you to reopen it. That is why healthy love often feels quieter, less dramatic, less chaotic, less confusing. Not because it's less passionate, but because your nervous system finally has permission to rest. And if peace feels unfamiliar, don't mistake that feeling for a lack of love. Sometimes peace is exactly what love was supposed to feel like all along. But there's one final misunderstanding. The one that quietly convinces people they're too much for years. And once you understand it, you'll never apologize for your depth again. The fifth sign. The right person won't ask you to become smaller. Imagine standing in front of someone with your entire heart open. You speak honestly. You love fully. You celebrate deeply. You apologize sincerely. You remember little details. You ask meaningful questions. You notice changes in their voice. You care. Not because you have to, because that's naturally who you are. Now imagine someone looking at all of that and calling it too much. For years, you might believe them. Until one day, you meet someone completely different. Someone who smiles because you remember the small things. Someone who appreciates your honesty instead of fearing it. Someone who doesn't run from emotional conversations. Someone who says, "Thank you for telling me how you feel," instead of, "You're overthinking." Suddenly, nothing about you changed. Your heart didn't become smaller. Your personality didn't become quieter. Your emotions didn't become weaker. The only thing that changed was the person standing in front of you. And in that single moment, you realize something that many people never discover. You were never difficult to love. You were simply offering your love where it couldn't be received. Flowers don't apologize because someone planted them in the wrong climate. They bloom the moment they find the right season. People are no different. Step back for a moment and look at everything we've explored. You questioned your worth when the real issue was compatibility. You edited yourself because you feared rejection. You mistook emotional unavailability for evidence that your needs were excessive. You confused chemistry with connection because your nervous system recognized familiar pain. And perhaps most importantly, you believed becoming smaller would finally make you easier to love. But love has never asked healthy people to disappear. Real love doesn't require less of you. It invites more of you. More honesty, more trust, more vulnerability, more authenticity. The people who are meant for your life won't admire the mask you created to survive. They'll cherish the person hiding behind it. Because the right relationship isn't built by finding someone who tolerates your depth. It's built by finding someone who meets you there. So if you've spent years believing you were too emotional, too intense, too sensitive, too caring, too honest, or simply too much, maybe it's time to ask a different question. Not how do I become easier to love, but why have I been trying to earn love from people who were never capable of giving the kind of love I needed? That single question has the power to change every relationship you'll ever choose. Because the goal was never to become less. The goal was always to find people who could finally appreciate everything you've always been. Remember this. The ocean has never been too deep. It only seems that way to someone standing in a puddle. And maybe, just maybe, you were never too much. You simply haven't met someone whose heart is deep enough to meet yours. If this message resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who spent too many years apologizing for the size of their heart. And if you're one of those people, let today be the day you stop shrinking yourself for people who were never willing to grow, because your depth was never your weakness. It has always been your greatest strength. Before you leave, I want you to try a small experiment. Close your eyes for just a second and think about every person who has ever made you feel like you were too much. Now, ask yourself something they probably never wanted you to ask. Were you really too much, or were they simply unable to meet you where you were? Because those are not the same thing. Someone who avoids difficult conversations will call honesty drama. Someone who fears commitment will call consistency pressure. Someone who has disconnected from their own emotions will call emotional openness intensity. But their labels were never objective truths. They were descriptions of their own limitations. For years, you may have carried words that never belonged to you. Too emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too thoughtful, too affectionate, too expressive, too deep. Yet notice something remarkable. These qualities are exactly what healthy relationships are built upon. Empathy, communication, loyalty, curiosity, presence, emotional courage. The very things someone rejected, another person will someday pray to find. That's one of psychology's quietest truths. People rarely appreciate qualities they're not yet capable of reciprocating. So stop measuring your value by the emotional capacity of people who never had room for you in the first place. A child cannot understand a masterpiece. That doesn't reduce the value of the painting. Likewise, someone who has never learned emotional intimacy cannot fully recognize its beauty when they encounter it. That isn't your failure. It's simply where they are in their journey. And perhaps this is the lesson you've needed all along. Your job was never to convince someone to love you correctly. Your job was never to translate your heart into a language that required less honesty. Your job was never to become easier. Your job was to remain authentic long enough to meet the people who speak your emotional language naturally. Because those people exist. They're the ones who don't disappear when conversations become real. The ones who don't punish vulnerability. The ones who don't make you feel guilty for having needs. The ones who don't ask you to become quieter, colder, or emotionally smaller just so they can feel comfortable. When you meet people like that, something incredible happens. You stop questioning yourself every day. You stop apologizing for caring. You stop overthinking every message. You stop wondering whether you're lovable, because love finally begins to feel safe instead of uncertain, calm instead of confusing, consistent instead of conditional. And that's when you realize you spent years trying to solve the wrong problem. You thought your heart needed fixing, when all it really needed was the right place to belong. So if you've recognized yourself throughout this video, don't promise yourself that you'll become less emotional. Burst yourself something much more important. Never again will you mistake someone's inability to love deeply for evidence that you are too difficult to love. Never again will you shrink your personality just to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. Never again will you apologize for the very qualities that make you capable of building extraordinary relationships. Because your sensitivity isn't weakness. Your honesty isn't weakness. Your depth isn't weakness. Your heart isn't too much. It has simply been waiting for another heart that knows how to hold it. And when that day comes, you won't have to force anything. You won't have to chase. You won't have to perform. You won't have to become someone else. For the first time in a very long time, you'll simply be yourself, and you'll finally understand that you were never too much. You were always enough. You just hadn't met someone who could match you. So step back for a moment. Look at everything we've talked about today. You weren't asking for perfection. You weren't asking for someone to complete you. You were asking for honesty, consistency, presence, someone willing to meet you with the same depth you offered them. Maybe that's never been too much. Maybe that's simply what healthy love has always looked like. The truth is, the wrong people will always make your standards feel unrealistic. The wrong people will always make your kindness feel excessive. The wrong people will always make your heart feel heavy. But the right people won't ask you to become less. They'll inspire you to become even more of who you already are. Because real connection isn't about finding someone who tolerates your depth. It's about finding someone who finally feels like home inside it. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Have you really been too much, or have you spent your life trying to be understood by people who were never emotionally capable of understanding you in the first place? Take a moment and be completely honest with yourself, because the answer to that single question may change every relationship you choose from this day forward. If this video helped you see yourself a little more clearly, share it with someone who's spent years apologizing for the size of their heart. And if you're still searching for people who truly understand the human mind and the hidden psychology behind our everyday lives, subscribe to Psychology Origins. Because sometimes the most important discovery you'll ever make is that there was never anything wrong with you to begin with.